Thank you very much, and for defending my good name that the vast project on the history of the UN was completed 5 years ago. And as everyone loves to say, the UN never finishes anything. We did finish that. It is true, it was not formally a UN project. The other thing I'd like to correct, I'm very pleased to be called Dr. Sir Jolly Richard. That's, I think, a better variation. And so be outraged, there are alternatives. The title actually is an inspiration. It's from Stefan Hessel. Some of you may have known that wonderful and very idealistic French diplomat who was often based in Geneva. And he wrote, when he was aged 93, a little document called Indignez-vous, and saying really to people today, particularly to the younger generation, those of us who were waterboarded during the Second World War, those of us who worked for the beginning of Europe, the establishment of welfare states and all of that. Young people, what are you doing today? Indignez-vous! So we borrowed the title, and I'm very pleased he agreed to to let us have an endorsement on the back. I should point out, for all of you who've written books and pamphlets, he was 93 and his booklet sold 4 million copies. I know, 3.5 million in French and 500,000 around the world. Someone about ours was nice enough to say, well, actually, you've only sold 4,000 copies, Richard, but it has rather more substance. So I want to give you the substance. We've got to keep to time, because the purpose of this and what I want to say at the very end about the Sustainable Development Goals is a lead into the discussion of blue sky thinking. Where should we be going? What should we ourselves be doing? But what sort of world do we envisage? So I want to start with the outrage. Let's see if it goes on. Outrage to hope to challenge. I'm going to go through very fast because these, the PowerPoint will be available for those who want it, and as you can actually download, I think, on the Oxfam website, this. Present strategies are not working. I hope all we heard yesterday, and including from Stuart, makes clear they're not. Debt, growth per capita employment, soaring income inequalities. The point about debt is that, perhaps I give a rather British perspective here. We've been told, battered by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, that nothing is more important than getting rid of the debt. So if you turn to the bottom of the right-hand side of the graph, that's the level of debt today, which is an absolute urgency, must cover everything. Well, the history of debt in other situations, particularly the end of the 2 world wars of the 20th century, is shown there. In our little booklet, Be Outraged, we begin with what actually happened when debt in Britain was at the peak. 1945. Well, what happened was the Labour government established a welfare state, brought in for the first time National Health Service, brought in pensions and all of that. Why was debt not the overwhelming, you can't do anything? Was debt neglected? No. Debt was gradually paid down, and there were a lot of difficulties in that. But by 1970, as you can see there, British debt was 40% of GNP as opposed to the 240%. When George Osborne began, I think British debt was about 65, 70%. Well, he's managed to push it up to about 85, 90. Anyway, be outraged. That's just the longer picture, because we know what it is from 1700. War doesn't help establishing debt. A reminder of Keynes, and it's useful to remember, free markets alone, of course, will not lead to full employment. Government action is needed. Government-led stimulus energizes the whole economy. Government debt is not the same as household debt, in spite of the fact that's one of the things which George Osborne loves to say, and it's absolute economic nonsense. And in recession, there is a liquidity trap. And when I learnt economics, it was mostly theory. Now we've had, 7 years or something demonstrating what is meant by a liquidity trap. And above all, the paradox of cuts and savings. When everyone's spending is cut or saved, total savings declines. Recession, said Keynes, is the time for deficits. Boom is the time to reduce debt. Well, I've got to go through the key things, and I haven't got time to read them all out. As I say, you can go through them because I want to keep going. But there were macroeconomic alternatives to stimulate demand. Stuart talked about some of them yesterday, but there are others too. And our little booklet indicated down, let me just underline, debt holidays. A year, 2 years without having to pay debt. Very important. And of course, it's not just Germany, as was brought out yesterday, but we can see other examples around the world. When the politics is right, of course, the US and the IMF can easily agree such things. And the world, the ceiling of the world does not come in, does not fall in. Alternatives for financial strategy, raise investment. Again, that was stressed. It's crazy how little has been done to raise investment at this time of unemployment and underutilization of full resources and so forth. Be outraged. And one of the things there we said was macro strategy needs to be changed, but alone is not enough. And I'm going to spin through, but let me just mention the key headlines. Reducing unemployment in other ways. And we stressed unemployment was a threefold waste, a waste of people's lives, a waste of potential production, a waste of the future generations of people learning and so forth. Need for action for caring economies. I hope when we come to blue sky thinking, we'll all say yes. And it's not only because I've got white hair and a sister who lives in a chair, that I'm now so much more conscious of the need for caring economies and support, not necessarily through salary, but often through that. And gender equality in caring. And inequality issues have soared. I hope you've read Piketty, a very, very important book. But may I recommend also the book by Tony Atkinson, Inequality, What Can Be Done? And there, it's a wonderful complement, and indeed, Tony Atkinson worked with Piketty on much of the original work, but Tony Atkinson's book, What Can Be Done, has 15 very practical actions, the first two relating to technology, if we're going to deal with inequality. And the key point about Be Outraged, there are alternatives. The 12 of us who wrote it, including Carlos 14, we're all people who'd worked most of our lives on developing countries. And we were outraged what can be done in Britain and in Europe. That was our focus of this little booklet. And for everything we said Europe should do, we gave examples from different developing countries, which were already doing it. So we weren't just talking off the top of our heads in terms of wouldn't it be nice. We were giving examples of those recommendations. And so the theme throughout the whole document is the North now needs to learn from the South. Now, on the issue of gender equality, and I must say my dear wife stressed the need for this cartoon to make clear that it wasn't just the washing machine and the clothes, but the papers, that women were also these days doing the triple tasks, involved in all sorts of office or other work and so forth. And we gave a lot of things that we thought needed to be done there. Public provision of care is a vital good, vital need, good for employment, a starting point for gender equality, and policymakers need to listen more to women and draw more on their experience of coping. We talk about the multitasking. Multi-coping by women have a lot of lessons for the rest of us. Reducing inequalities, I like that cartoon. Let me help you, sir, with your weight problem. And with the book of Piketty, which has had an amazing, drawn amazing attention, 500,000 copies sold in the United States alone, I think we may have a little bit of a window opportunity, not an easy one, but certainly our blue sky thinking ought to bring in major action on inequality. It's come to the fore now. Some people like Tony Atkinson have been working on it for 50, 60 years. It's not a new theme in economics, although it was a rather skillfully sidelined theme in neoclassical, neoliberal economics. But there's a range of actions that need to be and can be taken. And we're at an interesting point. I don't know how many of you have followed the experience in Latin America, but the experience in Latin America now well analyzed by my dear ex-UNICEF colleague Andrea Cornea of Italy and by Nora Lustig, based in New York. Most countries in Latin America substantially reduced Gini coefficients from 2000 to the present. Some slowing down, but not any reversal in the last few years. And a whole range of actions, I won't go into which ones were taken, certainly dealt with inequality at the lower level, the poverty levels, but also in some cases brought down somewhat at the higher levels. Andrea Cornea is now moving to try and do, he did a big book on Latin America. He's now working on Malawi and other countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Fewer cases, but somewhere inequality has been reduced. And there are others. My favorite, Malaysia. In 1969, they had race riots, so they set goals for, and poverty then I think was 52, 54% of the population. They set goals for a reduction of poverty, of course, and by the mid-1990s had achieved it, brought down to poverty, I think, to 4% or something. But they also had goals for more equitable sharing of capital assets, 25%, and also goals for a more equal representation in the civil service. All of those goals were set, they were achieved, very much related to reducing inequalities in the broadest sense. And I hope, while I'm just mentioning it, I hope people have seen the book by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett. Inequality is not merely income inequality or even asset inequality. It's a whole range of inequalities that affect our lifestyles, homicide rates, mental disease, and so on and so forth. That book called The Spirit Level by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett is a marvelous source and a very inspiring range of issues for action. So you made this problem, you helped clear it up, and there particularly the financial transactions tax. I remember when everyone said the financial transactions, a wonderful idea. It was actually James Tobin at Yale who came up with the idea in 1972. Now, so many people said it will never be. It has, I think, been approved by 9 countries in Europe, not, of course, Britain. Don't let us assume that that which is difficult cannot be. In fact, my daughter sent me a lovely quote. Your job is to get on with it. Afterwards, analyze why it was impossible. Making finance a good master and not a bad servant. And that actually goes to the heart of what we've seen politically, economically. It's not just capitalism we've seen in the last 20 years or so, it's financial capitalism. That's why I referred yesterday to the banksters. But again, it's not impossible to have regulation effectively. And we can see, as I think Stuart brought out yesterday, how the 80s were the period when the deregulation took place. Wouldn't it be wonderful how, with getting the Big Bang, the bonfire of all these regulations, everything would be better? Well, we need to discover, as Roosevelt did in the 1930s, the need for government to assert control and reform bankers' remunerations. Oh, I don't think I'll even mention it. I won't be able to finish. I'll be so outraged. Regional and global action. This was a final topic. I hope in the blue sky thinking we also think of that. I'm a UN man, and I had the good fortune of working for UNICEF and seeing goals which we took very seriously for the reduction of child mortality in the 1980s, before goals were really in again in the UN. And, well, at that time, 15 million children were dying worldwide in 1980. And under Jim Grant, our executive director, we took the goal, with the support of the board of others, of reducing this through a number of readily doable and implementable actions. This coverage of immunization against measles, against polio, all these things brought up by 1990, not distantly, to 80% in the world. Well, the world achieved almost that. At the time we thought it was. The Indian figures were overstated, but 61 individual countries achieved 80%. And of course, child mortality came down about 3 million over the 1980s, in spite of it being a lost decade in economic terms. And it's now down, as I think someone was saying to, yes, my UNICEF Hungarian colleague, to just under 7 million today. But that's an example where the UN can give a lead. I think there's other things also important. I personally feel the World Bank and the IMF need to work more with the rest of the UN. And we, of course, they need to democratize themselves to bring in particularly the emerging powers, China and so forth. I took part in a Chinese meeting on globalization, and they were outraged. You may remember in 2009 at the G20 meeting, it was agreed rather modest increases in the voting shares of the emerging powers was agreed. It's not been implemented. Why? Because the US Senate has not agreed. And there's other things, and in terms of longer blue sky thinking, a global reserve system, not actually a new idea. Keynes came up with it in the 1930s. Actions to diminish instabilities, and an international court for debt restructuring. Private companies can get that done just with their lawyers applying. It can't apply to countries. It needs to apply to countries. So there are alternatives, as the South now demonstrates. The longer we wait, the more people in Europe and in the industrial countries suffer, the longer to recover. There is no need for everyone to be an expert on all the details. In terms of mobilizing support and public action, we need to be saying we want a better world, not that we have to know the specifics of everything we want. And everyone needs to demand action now to implement the alternatives. Barely a month ago in the UN, well over 150 heads of state agreed the SDRs, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. They are really very blue sky thinking, and written in a rather blue sky way that some peoples, particularly some academics, have said, oh, well, just another one of these UN declarations. In my view, it's not just another UN declaration. First of all, it has the formal endorsement of all governments, virtually all governments, all the heads of state. And if you look back and think of all the problems that the world has had, all the wars we've gone on to, for a set of humane, sustainable goals to be agreed at the highest level of the UN is surely a very impressive change and advance. And I would like to suggest, Lawrence, that it provides a very good frame for our beginning of our blue sky thinking. You can criticize, and if you go through, as I think it's quite a long document to go through, because it's not only 17 goals and 169 targets. But one way, and it came up yesterday, is that not too many? Well, you can turn around the question another way. Read them, read the 17, even the others, and say, which would you leave out? And unlike the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, which were focused rather narrowly on health, education, mortality, and so forth, these cover a broader range of issues, all the issues relating to the improvements in the human conditions, children, women, men, and older people, dare I emphasize. Sustainability, not only environment, but a reference to consumption levels and production levels in relation to sustainability. Inequality, stressed goal 10, I think it is, and a peaceful and inclusive environment. It covers a very large range of the issues we can imagine at the moment as being, as Toynbee said, our generation is the first in human history which can imagine, no, which has the power to bring the benefits of civilization to the whole of the human race. And I think you will find that echoed there. But to me, there are several other points that are wonderful. First, they are universal goals. No longer the North telling the South down there what to do, but saying we're all in it together. Every country needs to take action, and the goals apply to every country. But aren't there too many? Someone said, it's expressly said that each country, with the benefit and prodding of its civil society and others, needs to set priorities for itself. So although the 17 goals are important, it's for each country to say in which are the ones that are most important, most immediate, need most action. Thirdly, and this is a key point that was rather missed out with the MDGs, and many academics criticize, it wasn't really a development agenda. Well, the goals and the targets for now aren't really a development agenda, but they are a frame of the targets and goals round which countries must themselves develop a development agenda, a coherent strategy. And to be honest, that allows for more state-oriented countries to take action. For people who pretend that the private sector alone will not, at least it provides some targets against which to monitor the weaknesses and so forth. And finally, and with this I think I almost end, involvements of civil society are very much recognized in the setting of priorities, in the monitoring, and an interesting thing recommended by the UN Committee on Development Planning, the need for peer review of progress by countries at a regional level. That's already done in OECD, been long done for aid programs. Why not peer review in terms of meeting the goals? One quote we used to like in UNICEF was Thoreau. Don't be afraid to build castles in the sky. But when you've established them, your job is to build the foundations under them. I hope that will work for our blue sky thinking. Thank you.